Ever feel like your decisions are swayed by something you can't quite put your finger on? Well, get this, our deep dive today explores how those seemingly gut choices might actually be influenced by the levels of hormones swirling around in our systems. We're talking testosterone, progesterone, the whole hormonal symphony.
It's fascinating how often we view decision-making as this purely rational process, when in reality our biology is in the mix as well.
Right. And to unpack all of this, we're taking a deep dive into a 2014 research paper from Frontiers in Neuroscience. These researchers designed a really interesting study using a risk game to see how these hormone levels actually impact the choices people make.
What's particularly clever about their approach is that they designed this game called the Hagler's Risk Game, specifically to remove the element of learning.
Right.
There's no winning strategy, just a series of choices based on predicting whether the next card will be higher or lower.
So no sneaky patterns to pick up on. It's all about those split-second decisions made under uncertainty. And they had a pretty good mix of participants, 71 women and 45 men.
And even within those groups, they broke things down further. For the women, they looked at those in different phases of their menstrual cycle, follicular, luteal, and also those taking oral contraceptives.
Because as anyone who's ridden the hormonal roller coaster knows, those fluctuations can make a big difference in how you feel and potentially how you make decisions.
Exactly. And with the men, they wanted to see if the natural daily variations in testosterone levels would have an impact. So they tested some in the morning when testosterone is typically higher, and others in the afternoon when levels are lower.
Okay, so we've got our players, we've got our game, we've got our hormones.
Yeah.
What did they actually find?
Well, let's start with the menstrual cycle findings, because I think this will resonate with a lot of our listeners, especially those who lead and manage teams where these dynamics are always at play.
Right.
Now, you might have heard that women are more risk-averse during certain phases of their cycle.
Yeah.
But the study actually found no significant overall difference in risk-taking between the different groups of women.
So busting those myths right off the bat.
Yeah.
I have to admit that was a bit of a surprise to me too. But wait, there's more to the story, right?
Because even though there wasn't a big overall difference, there were some really interesting nuances within those findings. For example, in women who were in the luteal phase, where progesterone levels are naturally higher, they found that those with higher progesterone levels were actually faster to make those high-risk decisions.
So it wasn't that they were choosing the risky option more often, but that their brains were processing those choices more quickly when progesterone was high.
Exactly.
That's really intriguing.
It is. And it suggests that even if there's no overall behavioral difference, hormones might still be subtly impacting how we process information and make those split-second decisions. And this raises some interesting questions about how these hormonal fluctuations throughout the month might be impacting the choices we're making, even in those seemingly objective, rational business decisions.
Right, because let's be real, nobody's making decisions in a vacuum. We're all walking bundles of hormones, whether we realize it or not. Now, what about the guys? Did time of day and those testosterone levels have any impact on their risk-taking?
This is where it gets even more interesting. While the men tested in the morning did have higher testosterone, as expected, it didn't actually lead to a significant difference in their risk-taking behavior compared to those tested in the afternoon.
So higher testosterone doesn't necessarily equal a higher appetite for risk?
Nope.
That challenges some of the common assumptions out there.
It does, and it highlights the need for more nuanced research in this area. Now, when they looked at both men and women together, they did find something interesting related to overall testosterone levels. People with lower testosterone, whether they were male or female, had faster reaction times overall.
So high testosterone doesn't automatically mean you'll be jumping out of airplanes, and low testosterone doesn't make you slow or indecisive.
Precisely. It's a reminder that hormones are just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to understanding decision-making.
Remember how they found that men tested in the morning when testosterone was higher were actually more likely to make those high-risk decisions if they also scored high on anxiety?
That finding really caught my eye, too.
Yeah.
It flips the script on the common belief that anxious people are inherently risk-averse.
It does. And it makes you wonder, are there situations where a certain level of anxiety, coupled with those hormonal influences, might actually push someone towards a riskier choice?
It's definitely a question worth exploring.
Yeah.
You know, before we jump into the practical applications of all of this, I think it's helpful to take a step back and look at the bigger picture of decision-making research, especially when it comes to gender and hormones.
Okay, let's zoom out for a minute. What's the context here?
Well, for a long time, there's been this debate in the research world about whether there are fundamental differences in how men and women approach risk. Some studies, particularly those using a task called the Iowa gambling task, have suggested that men tend to make more advantageous, less risky choices over time.
Okay.
But those findings often don't emerge until later in the task,
Interesting.
after participants have had a chance to learn and adjust their strategies.
So initially, men and women seem to perform similarly on this task.
And there's also been some research suggesting that women's performance on the Iowa gambling task might be influenced by their menstrual cycle, but those results have been pretty inconsistent.
Which makes sense given the hormonal complexity we've been talking about.
Right, so this study wanted to bypass those learning effects and focus on those more immediate gut-level decisions, which is where the Hagler's risk game comes in.
It's like they wanted to strip away all the layers of strategy and experience to see what's happening in those raw initial choices.
Exactly. And they also wanted to address some of the gaps in how previous research had looked at testosterone's role in risk-taking. Many studies have found a connection between higher overall testosterone levels and a greater willingness to take risks, but they often didn't account for those natural fluctuations throughout the day.
Which is why these researchers specifically compared men tested in the morning versus the afternoon.
Right. They wanted to see if those diurnal variations in testosterone actually translated to a difference in behavior. And as we discussed, they didn't find a significant effect there, but they did find that interesting link between higher testosterone, anxiety, and increased risk-taking in those men tested in the morning. It's almost as if those men were experiencing a kind of double whammy effect. The biological push of testosterone combined with the psychological tension of anxiety.
It's a reminder that decision-making isn't this linear, predictable process.
Right.
It's this complex interplay of biology, psychology, and probably a whole bunch of other factors we haven't even uncovered yet.
I completely agree. And this study, with its focus on menstrual cycle phases, time of day, and those overall testosterone comparisons, provides a really valuable glimpse into that complexity.
Okay, so we've talked about the research questions, the different groups of participants, and those intriguing findings. But I'm curious, what were some of the specific methods they used to measure all of this?
Well, to track those all-important hormone levels, they collected saliva samples from the participants. It's a non-invasive and pretty easy way to get a snapshot of those hormonal fluctuations. And they also used a variety of questionnaires to assess things like verbal intelligence, sensation-seeking, impulsivity, anxiety, and depression.
Because it's not just about the hormones in isolation, it's about understanding the whole person, their personality, their mood, their individual quirks.
Exactly. They were trying to get a holistic picture of each participant, not just their biological profile, but also their psychological makeup.
I love that approach.
Yeah.
It's so much more realistic and relatable than just reducing people down to their hormone levels.
And this study is a great example of how researchers are starting to look at human behavior through a more integrated lens. We're not just walking hormone factories. We're also shaped by our personalities, our experiences, and the context we find ourselves in.
Which leads to a question I've been pondering this whole time. So what? What does this research actually mean for our listeners, particularly those in leadership or management roles? How do we take this science and translate it into practical action?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? One of the most important takeaways is that we, as leaders, need to be aware of this complex interplay of factors influencing our own decisions and those of our team members.
It's recognizing that those seemingly rational choices we make each day aren't happening in a void.
Right.
There's a whole symphony of hormones and emotions playing in the background, whether we're conscious of it or not.
And that awareness can lead to more empathy and understanding in the workplace. Imagine leading a team where people felt comfortable saying, hey, I'm not feeling at my best today. My hormones are all over the place, and I might need a little extra time to process this decision.
That would be amazing. It's about creating a culture where vulnerability is seen as a strength, not a weakness, where people feel safe to acknowledge their own internal rhythms and ask for support when they need it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as leaders, we can model that vulnerability ourselves.
Right.
Imagine a world where it was normal for a manager to say, I'm not feeling super confident in my decision-making abilities today. Maybe we should revisit this tomorrow with fresh eyes.
That would be a game changer. It's about moving away from that tough guy leadership style and embracing a more human-centered approach.
And another practical takeaway is to be mindful of the timing of important decisions. If you know a team member is going through a period of hormonal fluctuation, maybe it's not the best time to ask them to make a high-stakes decision.
That's such a simple but important point. It's about being sensitive to those individual rhythms and finding ways to support people through those challenging times.
Now, this study focused on hormones, but it also highlighted the importance of those personality traits, particularly anxiety,
Right.
and that unexpected finding that men with higher testosterone and high anxiety were more likely to take risks. Really underscores the need for individual assessment.
Right. We can't just assume that everyone will respond to their hormones in the same way. There's this whole layer of individual variability that we need to be attuned to as leaders.
It's about understanding the unique constellation of factors that influence each person's decision-making style and then tailoring our leadership approach accordingly.
So it's about recognizing that everyone is navigating their own internal landscape, their own hormonal symphony, if you will.
Exactly. And that recognition, that empathy, is what can truly elevate leadership from good to great.
I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, before we wrap up this deep dive into the world of hormones and decisions, I want to leave our listeners with one final provocative thought. What if, instead of viewing these hormonal fluctuations as something to be ignored, or even worse, feared, we started to see them as a source of valuable insight? What if by understanding these biological rhythms, we could actually harness them to make more informed, more aligned decisions?
I love that reframing.
Yeah.
It's so easy to fall into the trap of seeing hormones as unpredictable forces that throw a wrench into our otherwise rational minds. But what if they're actually giving us clues about how our brains are operating at any given moment?
Right. It's like, instead of trying to fight against our biology, what if we leaned into it? What if we paid attention to those subtle shifts in energy focus and risk tolerance and use that information to our advantage?
Imagine a world where instead of pretending we're these perfectly consistent, emotionless decision-making machines, we actually acknowledged our hormonal reality, where we could say, based on where I am in my cycle, I'm feeling a little more cautious than usual.
Okay.
Let's table this decision for a couple of days so I can process it more thoroughly.
I'm feeling super energized and creative today. Let's brainstorm some bold new ideas.
It's about tapping into that inner wisdom, that biological intelligence, and using it to inform our choices.
And that applies not just to our own decision-making, but also to how we lead and manage others. It's about creating a culture where people feel safe to acknowledge those hormonal realities without judgment or stigma.
Imagine a team meeting where instead of powering through, even when people are clearly feeling off, there's a sense of shared understanding, where it's okay to say, hey, I'm not feeling my sharpest today. Can someone else take the lead on this?
It's about fostering a sense of psychological safety where people can be their full, authentic self.
Right.
Hormones and all.
And I think this research, with its emphasis on those subtle but significant hormonal influences, really underscores the need for that kind of sensitivity and awareness in the workplace.
It's a call to action for all of us as leaders, managers, and even just as individuals, to start paying closer attention to those internal rhythms, both in our and in others.
And to recognize that what might seem like a weakness, that fluctuation, that variability, might actually be a strength in disguise.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we encourage you to keep these insights in mind. Pay attention to your own hormonal rhythms. Notice how they influence your decision-making, and extend that same awareness and compassion to those around you. Who knows what brilliant choices we might make when we start working with.
What a fantastic thought to leave our listeners with. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating journey into the world of hormones and decision-making.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive.